Those 7 seconds were not hesitation. They were the exact amount of time I needed to calculate a maneuver that would protect thousands of sailors, a decision that ultimately became part of the record cited with my silver star. My brother's glass slipped from his hand and hit the table. The color disappeared from my father's face, and the silence that followed felt almost unbearable. Richard finally managed to speak, saying that I had never told him any of this. I looked directly at him and answered calmly that he had never asked. The words seemed to hit harder than any argument could have. For years, I had tried to share pieces of my life with him, only to have them dismissed or compared to something he believed was more important. Now he stood in the middle of the impressive dinner he had carefully arranged, completely undone by a truth he had never taken the time to discover. Admiral Vance reached across the table and shook my hand with genuine respect. Before leaving, he thanked my mother for the dinner and offered a polite goodbye to everyone. Then he walked out into the night. The moment the front door closed, my father's embarrassment quickly turned into anger. He accused me of deliberately humiliating him in his own home in front of the one man whose opinion he had spent decades trying to earn. I remained calm and told him that I had stopped sharing my life with him years earlier because he always found a way to minimize the things that mattered to me. I was not trying to embarrass him. I had simply reached the point where I could no longer keep pretending that his approval was necessary. Richard had no response. He stood silently while Caleb watched from the doorway, apparently seeing our father in a completely different light for the first time. Later that evening, my mother asked me to come upstairs with her. Inside her bedroom, she opened an old shoebox that I had never seen before. It was filled with newspaper clippings, Navy publications, base newsletters, and printed citations documenting different stages of my career. She admitted that she had quietly followed everything I had accomplished for nearly 20 years. Then she confessed that her silence had been wrong. She had avoided celebrating my achievements openly because she was afraid of triggering another argument with my father or making him feel challenged. She said she had convinced herself that staying quiet would keep the peace, but she now understood that her silence had also hurt me. My mother noticed the sealed envelope still inside my purse and gently told me to open it. I finally broke the seal and read the official orders assigning me to command an entire missile cruiser squadron in the coming months. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She hugged me and told me how proud she was. It was the first time in my adult life that a parent had openly celebrated one of my accomplishments without adding a warning, comparison, or criticism. The next morning, I drove away from my childhood home as rain covered the windshield. Surprisingly, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel the need to punish my father or prove that I had won some kind of family competition. I simply felt lighter. For the first time, I understood that I could leave that house without carrying its expectations with me. Over the following months, our family dynamic slowly changed. Kayla began calling me and asking genuine questions about my career, not to impress our father, but because he actually wanted to understand the life I had built. My father gradually lost his ability to control the story everyone told about our family. At my major change of command ceremony, several months later, my mother and brother sat proudly in the front row. My father stood quietly near the back, listening as my accomplishments were formally announced. After the ceremony, Master Chief Ortega approached me with a familiar smile. He reminded me that recognition from other people was never what made someone a strong leader. The real measure was what you did when nobody was watching, and whether you could make the right decision when it mattered. Later, my father finally approached me on the pier. Behind us stood the massive warship I had been entrusted to command. He looked at the vessel for a long moment before quietly asking me to tell him everything about her. So I did. I explained the systems, the crew, the responsibilities, and the decisions that came with commanding a ship of that size. Standing there beside him, I realized something I had spent years trying to understand. Your self-worth does not come from people who refuse to recognize you. It is built through the quiet choices you make when you finally stop shrinking yourself for someone else and allow yourself to stand at your full height. I was actively commanding a warship during high-stakes operations in international waters. The defining moment came in a narrow, heavily congested passage when our strike group faced a coordinated attack involving sea-skimming missiles and fast attack boats approaching from several directions. As the tactical action officer monitored the incoming threats, I realized our assigned position was not enough to protect the aircraft carrier at the center of the formation. I had exactly 7 seconds to choose between staying in our designated position or making an aggressive maneuver that would put my ship directly in the path of the incoming threat. I gave the order. Our ship turned sharply into position, and the crew responded exactly as trained. Our defensive system successfully dealt with the incoming threats, allowing the carrier to continue safely while everyone aboard my ship made it through the engagement. Months later, after receiving a silver star for my actions during that operation, I returned home on leave. By coincidence, my father was preparing to host Admiral Vance for dinner. Richard had spent an entire week polishing the silverware, organizing the dining room, and rehearsing stories from his Navy years, determined to impress the senior officer whose respect he had spent 4 decades trying to earn. Before the Admiral arrived, my father pulled me aside in the kitchen. He sternly warned me not to talk about my ordinary office work and told me to keep the conversation casual. According to him, military discussions should be left to men who actually understood command. I simply nodded, refusing to argue. What he did not know was that the unopened envelope inside my bag contained orders assigning me to command an even larger naval vessel. When dinner began, my father quickly took control of the conversation. He proudly introduced Caleb by his impressive corporate title, then described me simply as his daughter who worked a quiet shore position for the Navy. I said nothing. I had become accustomed to being underestimated at that table. Eventually, the conversation turned toward the recent engagement involving our strike group. My father confidently announced that the destroyer captain had hesitated during the attack and had nearly allowed the aircraft carrier to be destroyed. I could not sit there quietly while the actions of my crew were being misrepresented. I calmly explained that the destroyer had intentionally changed position to intercept the incoming threat and protect the carrier. Richard immediately snapped at me. He demanded to know who had given me permission to speak and dismissed my explanation as the uninformed opinion of someone who had only read about military operations. For a moment, I felt the familiar weight of 30 years spent making myself smaller just to avoid another argument with him. I reached toward the coffee pot, ready to let the conversation move on. Then Admiral Vance suddenly stood. He looked directly at me and addressed me by my military rank. The entire dining room went completely silent. Vance then turned toward my father and asked whether he truly understood who had been clearing the dinner plates that evening. My father stared at him, clearly confused. The Admiral explained that I was not simply a Navy employee working behind a desk. Professionally, I was the commanding officer of the destroyer my father had just criticized, the same officer who had ordered the maneuver that placed the ship across the threat axis and helped protect his carrier. He explained that the 7 seconds my father had dismissed as hesitation were actually the 7 seconds I had spent making the decision that determined where my ship would be when the attack reached the formation. The smell of slightly burnt coffee hung in the dining room, but the real tension came from my father's voice when he asked who had given me permission to speak. His thumb was pressed so tightly against the stem of his glass that his fingernail had turned completely white. Sitting 3 seats away was Rear Admiral Arthur Vance, a retired flag officer my father had admired for decades. My brother Caleb stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth, while my mother suddenly became very interested in the embroidered tablecloth. Inside my purse was an unopened official Navy envelope containing details of my next assignment. My father still believed I worked behind a quiet desk. He had no idea that the guided missile destroyer he had just criticized as poorly commanded and overly cautious was actually my ship. He also had no idea that the 7 seconds he was mocking were the exact 7 seconds I had spent deciding whether to put my ship and its crew between an incoming missile attack and an aircraft carrier carrying nearly 5,000 people. Arthur Vance slowly placed his mug on the table with a sharp click that seemed to silence the entire room. He looked at me the way an officer looks at someone he recognizes but never expected to see wearing civilian clothes. My father, completely unaware of what was happening around him, apparently thought his attempt to embarrass me had succeeded. He ordered me to go into the kitchen and make more coffee for the guests. I had grown up in a small coastal town in Virginia, where the Navy was more than just a career choice in our household. It was practically a religion, and my father, Richard, considered himself its unquestioned authority. A framed photograph from his younger years hung in our hallway, showing him at 26, standing on the bridge of a frigate with his uniform cover tucked beneath his arm. He eventually retired as a captain, leaving behind an honorable record that most people would have been proud of. But my father spent the rest of his life bitter about the one command he believed he deserved but never received. That disappointment followed him everywhere and slowly turned our home into a place where criticism came easily and praise was almost impossible to earn. My older brother, Caleb, learned early that the safest way to survive was to agree with our father, build a respectable corporate career, and never make choices that challenged Richard's expectations. I chose the ocean instead, and from the beginning, my decision felt to my father like a personal betrayal. When I was 12, I watched a carrier homecoming on television and announced that one day I would stand on one of those flight decks myself. Without even looking up from his newspaper, my father casually told me that they apparently let just about anyone onto those ships now. Years later, when I showed him my Naval Scholarship acceptance letter, he barely read the first line before saying he hoped I had chosen something administrative or medical rather than an actual command position. At 18, I packed my duffel bags and left the house before sunrise. Tucked inside my uniform, I found a tiny folded note from my mother reminding me that the ocean was far bigger than the house I was leaving behind. The military never cared about my father's limited expectations. It cared about whether I could make difficult decisions when the consequences were measured in lives, sometimes at 3 a.m. during violent weather when there was no time to hesitate. During my first deployment in the Arabian Sea, our ship received a distress call from a burning merchant vessel caught in dangerous waters. I maneuvered our position carefully, creating the precise approach the rescue helicopter needed to reach the injured crew members. 3 people survived because our team got the timing and positioning right. After that, I stopped trying to collect achievements just to prove something to my father. A veteran Master Chief, named Ortega, once found me staring toward the horizon and told me something I never forgot. Nobody from my past was going to climb out of the water someday just to validate the work I had done. By the time I was 38, I had earned command of a guided missile destroyer, accepting responsibility for a warship and hundreds of sailors. I deliberately did not invite my family to the ceremony because I was exhausted from watching every accomplishment get reduced or dismissed. For 3 years, my family continued believing that I spent my days behind a desk managing spreadsheets, never realizing what my actual responsibilities were.